In this episode, we discuss PTSD and struggles with suicide. If you are thinking about suicide, are worried about a friend or loved one, or would like emotional support, please contact the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at suicidepreventionlifeline.org or by phone by dialing 988. Hello, and welcome back to It's a Very Exciting Time, a podcast by a UFO nerd and his tolerant friend. My name is Scott, and I've been fascinated by the phenomenon my whole life.
And my name is Chuck. I'm an aerospace nerd and a tolerant friend.
We started this podcast because since 2017 there have been shocking revelations, from news of secret Pentagon programs to confirmed Navy videos of astonishing craft. In a nutshell, now that the government has admitted that UFOs are real,
or at least that the videos were authentic,
it raises a natural question. If UFOs are real, what else? Suddenly, some of these other parts of the phenomenon that seemed unlikely are pulled into the realm of the possible.
Right? And they may still be unlikely. There's so many explanations for these stories. Even if the truth is more mundane than we're hoping, if any of this turns out to be true,
whoo! It's a very exciting time. All right, Chuck, I think I'm finally ready to do this. This is like take 5 of our intro. I keep messing it up, but we've got a wild show today, man. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm ready. I'm like 4 takes deep ready.
Yeah, you're mostly ready because you've been listening to me fudge the opening over and over. Get to the show.
Yeah, get to the aliens already.
Get to the aliens, yeah. We've got to get some shirts printed up. I was thinking there's a construction YouTube series I watch where the company is owned by 2 brothers. One of the brothers is kind of the main guy on camera. He does all the editing. And his brother, Jamie, loves dad jokes. He loves puns. And he is incredibly verbose. He's like, I want to show you a technique today. And he'll start talking. And like his brother will straight up like fast forward him or like trim it down to the point where it's just a running gag. You know, like Jamie's like, none of this is going to be in the episode. Yeah. His brother's like, we'll see.
Yeah.
But the point is, they keep getting their listeners sending in merch that they've made with the hashtag Let Jamie Talk.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And I've been joking that we need some of the same. So yeah, maybe we get up a shirt like Let Chuck Talk, and then make another one with Get to the Aliens.
Yeah, I love this. Hashtag UFO Daddy and UFO Mama Bear. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, we definitely need a UFO Daddy shirt. Yeah. All right. Anyway, so today we are going to be talking about an unfortunate incident with David Grusch. Okay. They kind of tried to smear him by leaking his struggles with PTSD. It's an awful thing that I don't really want to dwell on, but it is newsworthy. We are going to talk about it. But after that, I've got a real treat for you, buddy.
Okay.
You may remember a month or 2 ago, I came to you and told you about a really weird Reddit post by a scientist who claimed to be working in the like genetic reverse engineering program where they have the alien bodies.
Okay. Yeah.
So I wasn't sure how to handle it. And so much other newsworthy stuff was happening that I kept putting it to the bottom. So anyway, this is the week
it's time.
We're going to get into it. He makes some wild claims, buddy. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, Congress should go on recess more often. This is great.
I mean, I don't know about that. No, I would kind of like it if they did their job more.
Yeah, all right, fair.
Yeah. Okay, so, like I said, this first topic, talking about David Grusch, I just want to be clear going into it. This is exhausting and demoralizing to talk about. It took me like an hour to put together the notes on this section. I'm actually hoping we're going to breeze through it real fast.
Okay.
Because, as we'll talk about, UFO Twitter kind of tore itself apart over this story. And there was a lot of name calling, a lot of accusations. I saw some people that I really respect in the industry say some things that I really don't care for and take some unfortunate positions. It's one of those kind of divisive topics. So like I said, I don't want to linger on it too much because it's unpleasant, and I apologize to our viewers because that's my attitude coming into it. But I do think it's worth talking about. So the first thing to know is on Tuesday, David Grusch released a statement via Ross Coulthart, who's one of the journalists that worked with him when he came out as a whistleblower. And I just want to read this statement. He says, quote, "The mental health struggles of U.S. military and intelligence community personnel is a broad issue that's very close to my heart, and I believe it should be discussed in an open environment due to the stigmas associated with the subject. It has come to my attention that The Intercept intends to publish an article about 2 incidents in 2014 and 2018 that highlight previous personal struggles I've had with post-traumatic stress disorder, grief, and depression. Like many veterans, I struggled after returning home from Afghanistan. Furthermore, I was personally affected again years later when a close friend of mine, an intelligence officer who was serving in Air Force Special Operations Command at the time, took his own life shortly after we last spoke. I am proud to be transparent on this matter, and am glad I got the help I needed to continue my intelligence career and maintain my top secret secure clearance information with multiple agencies."
So this came out before the article, right?
Yeah. So on Tuesday, they put this up. This is the first anybody had heard about this article.
Amazing.
I will remind you that at the hearing, he said he had information that further attempts to discredit him were in the works. He knew about those. I don't know if that was this or if he was talking about something more broad, but, hey, here we are like a week later, and yeah, they did.
Yeah, I suppose when you're in the intelligence community, you're supposed to know that kind of stuff, so makes sense.
Yeah. So Ross Coulthart appeared on News Nation that night, and he accused the intelligence community of leaking the info. He said it could only have come from Grusch's secret files, his medical records in the intelligence community, or from the sheriff's office, because we're talking about some incidents where the police were called. And Coulthart said he called the sheriff's office, and the sheriff confirmed to him that it did not come from the sheriff's office.
Interesting.
Now, like I said, UFO Twitter exploded for 24 hours. This was all anyone was talking about, and everybody in the world was chiming in on it. All the podcast hosts I like, all the reporters I like, all the UFO personalities, they were all chiming in. And anything you can imagine how people would feel about David Grusch, mental health struggles, leaks from the press, it all was fair game. There were people accusing the CIA directly of attempting to smear David Grusch. There were people who were accusing both Grusch and Coulthart of manufacturing a conspiracy theory.
Do you think that did they manufacture that just because he came out first, or what?
Sorry, let's finish talking about it because some more stuff happened after that. But in a nutshell, the community goes crazy. There were lots of debates over the difference between a leak and a tip that got really heated and ugly. John Greenwald from the Black Vault, who specializes in FOIA requests, said a lot of really unfortunate things that caused me to lose some respect for him. The article itself was published on Wednesday, and I'm not linking to the article. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but in a nutshell, it detailed 2 incidents where Grusch had the cops called on him after threatening suicide. The article made it clear that the records were neither confidential, medical, nor leaked, but came from a routine Freedom of Information request to the sheriff's office.
This is actually, I didn't realize, but this is a really political thing. In Florida, part of the reason we have such a Florida man thing is that Florida has radically open transparency about arrest records. And many other states, Oregon, do not, and don't publish those unless someone is found guilty or Actually, I don't know when Oregon does it, but.
So where this gets complicated is what he's being accused of, the author of the article, and how he defends himself aren't necessarily in disagreement. Coulthard is saying you were tipped off to go get his medical records.
Sure.
He said, I didn't get his medical records. I filed a Freedom of Information request about the addresses that he lived in, which is all public information, and got back these police arrest reports that don't have names, but are about the people who lived in that house. And we knew that David Grusch and his wife lived in these houses at these times.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so it got really messy. And of course, UFO Twitter just further entrenched. Everybody who was thinking that Grusch and Coulthard were fanning the flames and making something out of nothing doubled down. Everybody who thought that he was tipped off by the feds doubled down. Interestingly, I think this would have been one of those things where we would be talking about it, and I would say, I think Coulthard jumped to a conclusion here. It seems pretty level-headed, except the author of the article, later on Wednesday, after publishing it, was in a Twitter space where people were asking him questions about it, and he straight up admitted that Intel folk tipped him off to go look for the arrest record. So I've got a quote from him here. He says, I was getting bits and pieces from different people about stuff they were saying. So you know how Intel people, they're vague. They'll be like, look into his background. And they were hinting. Multiple people told me to just look at any run-ins with law enforcement that they had had and he had had in the past.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, Ross Coulthard on Twitter after this happened, feeling a bit vindicated, as you might imagine, said, it is now admitted by the journalist himself that he was told where to look by sources inside the intelligence community who were trying to smear David Grusch. Their tip could only have come from Grusch's highly classified security files.
Yeah.
Again,
so
yeah, there's room to interpret this, right?
Yeah. Counterpoint. If you want to find shit about someone, what's the first thing you look for? Arrest records. Like,
yeah.
How did this not come up before? Or not arrest, but like, police records.
Well, and I'm not mentioning some of the other things people were aggro about. So one of the guys was like, yo, like, it takes months to get a FOIA request filed. He filed this, and like 2 days later, he had the answer. That says to me, someone inside was doing it. And the journalist actually came out and he's like, people want to seize on this, but they're not understanding. Like, yeah, if you go to the federal or state level, they're swamped and it takes a long time. You go to these like local departments, they're not swamped, and it's not actually that uncommon to get a fast turnaround on it because there's just someone in the office who their job is to answer the emails and fill out FOIA requests.
Yeah, right. And it's basically random access. You don't know whether it's going to be hard to get a hold of or not. And turns out this one was easy, but that doesn't mean they all are. Yeah.
Now, I'm inclined to believe that Coulthard is right that there were people in the intel community who were trying to smear David Grusch. I'm just not convinced it was like a coordinated top-down, character assassination.
Probably not.
Tim Burchett, Representative Tim Burchett, who we've heard from a lot lately, said, this is just disgusting. Someone needs to lose their job. George Knapp, another respected journalist from Las Vegas, said, the attempted slime job on Dave Grusch is too late to stop his testimony, but is a serious warning to anyone else who might step forward. It tells potential witnesses that every aspect of their lives will be fair game. I think that's a really good point. And arguably, I think that's, if you do want to believe that there is a larger effort inside the intelligence community or the DOD to try to keep this story down, George is right. It's too late to stop Grusch. He's already testified. But we keep hearing there are other whistleblowers. I think this was more intended as a shot across the bow for all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, it seems like Grusch would be very difficult to assault. Like he's kind of, he's our good boy.
Yeah.
He's perfect.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So this is absolutely about the people who aren't as incredibly perfect citizens. So makes total sense that that's what this is about.
Yeah. Now I want to close this section down in terms of my quotes with a quote from Lou Elizondo, who has been fighting for UFO transparency since the 2017 article. He's another insider who quit his job in the Defense Department to come out and fight for UFO transparency.
Yeah.
He said, "The silent suffering of our brave men and women in uniform is a cost our veterans pay to keep our society free. A veteran's PTSD should never be used against them. Shame on any journalist who writes bullshit articles attacking a veteran for the health consequences of their service to our nation."
Hell yeah.
And that's kind of where I want to leave it, because at the end of the day, whatever you think of David Grusch, whatever you think of whether or not there's a conspiracy in the government to silence him, to keep this a secret, whatever, at the end of the day, a journalist received a tip that this guy was having mental health struggles, investigated it, and decided to publish it. And there's just no good reason to do that. He did not lose his clearances. Clearly, whatever happened, his bosses knew about it. They didn't feel the need to yank his clearances or take him out. If they didn't lose faith in him, this is not a story. This is not, it has nothing to do with his claims. This is just throwing mud at someone and shaming them for their mental health issues. And this is why I feel so icky about the whole thing. Like, I hate everything about this story. I wish it hadn't happened. I wish we weren't talking about it, but here we are.
Yeah, totally. Completely agreed with that. Like, veterans with PTSD deserve nothing but love and support. And like you said, he kept his security clearances for a reason. And I think, I think that I am not qualified to like evaluate whether someone should have a clearance. I have to trust the people who do that, that they know more than I do. But maybe a positive thing we can look at this. Have you heard about the Ad Fontes like media bias and reliability chart?
No.
Okay, it's a very cool thing. So Ad Fontes is an organization that categorizes news organizations by both their political leaning and the quality of their reporting. And I hadn't heard of The Intercept before this. So the first thing I did was look it up in Ad Fontes, and you can clearly see that The Intercept is in this like yellow band of wide variability of reliability, which is not a great section to be in. So being in yellow already tells me that The Intercept isn't really worth reading, and I should be highly suspicious of anything I see there and dig in a lot further. But also, I looked up the researcher, and boy, does he look like a total shithead. Like,
yeah, there it is.
Like, he has a whole section on Wikipedia of like pranks, air quotes, pranks that he's played on people. And they all just seem like, I don't know. They just seem super shitty. So like, this is the quality of journalist at The Intercept. And it makes me, the only sad thing about this to me is that The Intercept is categorized as strongly left-leaning. But I guess it just goes to the point that being an asshole transcends political leanings.
Yeah, true story. All right, let's move on.
Cool.
Let's be done with this horrible moment in the UFO story. Chuck, let's get weird.
Oh my God. I've been waiting for you to say that.
So yeah, about a month ago, a post blew up on Reddit. The title of the post was, "From the late 2000s to the mid-2010s, I worked as a molecular biologist for a national security contractor in a program to study exobiospheric organisms. EBO. This was a relatively new Twitter account by the name of EBO Scientist.
Does what it says on the tin.
Does what it says on the tin. I do want to flag one thing right up front. So we're going to talk about a lot of what he wrote. We're also going to skip over a lot of what he wrote because he gets into some pretty advanced genetic stuff that I don't understand and would sound like an idiot if I tried to read any of it. But even as a know nothing like me, there was a lot of fascinating stuff in this.
Okay,
but
cool.
There was one bit at the beginning where he talked about, why am I doing this? Because I believe in transparency. But to protect my anonymity, I will be purposefully vague or even contradictory about any information that could identify me, date, education, role, etc. I will even introduce red herrings in this respect. I want to make it clear that any information related to the subject of the research will not be treated this way.
Okay.
So he tells us right up front, don't trust anything I say about myself necessarily. Right. I want to give you an idea of the type of person I am without revealing myself, but I'm going to tell you the truth about the organism.
Yeah, interesting. So I wonder also, this author doesn't mention anything about the program and whether there'll be red herrings or vagueness there.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on that in a minute. I suspect there are a few red herrings. He straight up says where the program is.
Oh, okay.
And everyone's like, what?
Okay, interesting.
So yeah, I've broken this up into a few sections. We're going to talk about details he gave about the program itself.
Okay.
We're going to talk about just a couple of things that he revealed in the section on the aliens' genetics. We've got a larger section talking about their anatomy because I find that fascinating. There's a section in here about the aliens' religion, which is buck wild.
Wow.
And then we're going to talk briefly about the kind of reactions to the post. And I want to bring one thing forward from when we talk about the reactions, which is Reddit has a way of getting to the bottom of things pretty quickly. If things are straight up bullshit or easily detectable, Reddit has a way of dragging that out. Reddit doesn't know what to make of this guy. And I read an equal number of pieces saying this is complete fraudulent bullshit and this is incredibly credible. And those reactions were coming from medical doctors, molecular biologists, people who have worked in high-tech labs who are talking about the things he says about the lab work are extremely credible.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay.
So yeah, starting out with the program, he says, the aim of the program was to elucidate the genome and proteome basis of these organisms. New high-throughput DNA sequencing technologies from the late 90s unblocked stagnant research. We've discovered that the EBO genome is a chimera of genomes from our biosphere and from an unknown one. They are artificial, ephemeral, and disposable organisms created for a purpose that still partially eludes us.
So you emphasized ephemeral and disposable in your voice, but doesn't that describe most organisms? Most of us are ephemeral.
I suppose ephemeral is true. Disposable and artificial, I would argue, are not applicable.
Okay, artificial maybe, but disposable, I think, to me, that just says, meat chicken or something. I don't know.
Sure, but we're not talking about meat chickens. We're talking about presumably intelligent beings. Yeah. I think the thing to compare it to would be humans. Nothing about us is disposable. Our biological systems are designed to keep us alive. We have a robust immune system. We have systems that self-regulate and repair. They don't last forever.
Oh, okay.
But you would really have to stretch to call us disposable just because we do end at some point. He's making a point here, and he gets into the details later. The artificial part is another part that he gets into a bit. He gets that from the genetics, and we'll talk about that later. But basically, that's his big claim right up front. Like, yeah, I was looking at a gray alien. They share parts from our biome and parts from another biome. So they're not just alien and they're not just human. They're a mix. They're a hybrid of both. Hybrid is a word that anybody in the UFO community is perking up their ears at now. He doesn't use the word hybrid. He uses chimera, but this is a claim we've heard for many years. So yeah, anyway.
Chimera is an interesting word in that way. So it sounds like it's...
He uses a lot of $10 words. He uses a lot of science words, right? The program was to elucidate the genome and proteome basis of these organisms.
Yeah.
You know, a normal person might just said, the program was to study the genetics of these organisms. You know?
Yeah. I noticed later on that in one of the quotes, it's spelled Grey. Like, they're either from the UK or they're just one of those people who spells gray fancy.
Right. He talked briefly about his onboarding into the program. Now, I'm skipping over all the stuff about the job interview. Nothing about that seemed remarkable to me. It sounded like what I would assume it looks like to interview for a position at a top secret, unacknowledged program, you know, lots of secrecy and, you know. But he said the first weeks on the job were by far the most memorable. Although I spent most of that time in a depressing archive room. It consists almost exclusively of reading about the subject of study and to get us up to speed. There is no secret Wikipedia or even a reference book to guide us. There are only dry reports, memos, presentations, procedures, and standard operating procedures. These documents are almost exclusively about the biology of EBOs, but there are also a few that deal with other subjects, such as their food, religion, or culture. There were no documents on their technology.
I know you mentioned religion earlier, and I guess I hadn't really actually connected that before. The first paragraph made me think these are like those microscopic space bears. But now I'm realizing these are actually gray aliens. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so to jump ahead a little bit, in the section on anatomy, he says these are your typical gray aliens. The only thing that didn't quite match your understanding of a gray alien when you think of it is he says they were nearly 5 feet tall. Most people that I've heard describing gray aliens describe them as noticeably short, like 3 to 4 feet tall.
Okay.
So I don't know. You know, 5 feet isn't tall, but it ain't short either.
Right.
The idea that they're disposable and engineered, but still have a religion is really interesting. And we'll talk about that later. The only thing I will say about that is, no, we'll talk about it in the religion section. It gets real weird.
I got some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So he talked a bit about the team. And I've kind of abbreviated this section. He said it was a team of around 20 scientists. There were 4 senior scientists and a director. The scientists, like myself, had as their main responsibility to carry out the technical work. As each scientist had a PhD, we were all somewhat overqualified for what is ultimately a technician's job. Other than the scientific staff, there were security guards working for one subcontractor or another. There were no support staff, such as janitors or maintenance workers. Scientists were responsible for this kind of work. In addition, logistical constraints ensure that every scientist is capable of carrying out any technical activity.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Like I see why they might say that PhDs are overqualified. And it kind of reads to me like a little bit of a complaint, like, oh, we had to wash our own beakers.
Oh, 100%.
But
although another way to look at it is he is about to describe a lot of hands-on technical research that in a normal lab would not be done by a PhD. So when he describes himself as a PhD and then says he's doing all this what other people might think of as grunt work or technical work. He's kind of explaining why. Yeah. And it makes perfect sense. Like you said, it's a small team. Every person they bring in risks breaching the security. So you want all of those people to be cross-domain, cross-functional, able to do every part of the job. And that means you can't just bring in a lot of students doing their postdoc research, it's gotta be actual qualified professionals.
Yeah. I bet this is the same at like the Manhattan Project.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
I don't either, but
he talked a bit about the lab itself, which I thought was interesting. Most notably, he named it. He said this was the Battelle National Biodefense Institute, located in Fort Detrick, Maryland.
Okay.
Which, it's a real place, and you can look it up. He says it's in a building that is used for legitimate biomedical research. The clandestine operations are carried out in a restricted part of the basement, out of sight from regular workers. Contrary to what one might imagine, the biosafety level is not maximal for this type of research. Indeed, the lab containing EBO samples or derived cell cultures is biosafety level 3, while the lab where assays are conducted is only biosafety level 2. The BSL-3 area of the facility includes a freezer room and a cell culture lab and is only accessible through an antechamber from the BSL-2 section.
Do you know what an assay is?
I don't. Through context, I'm assuming it means like an experiment or a procedure, something like that.
Okay, an analytical procedure used in science to determine the presence, amount, or activity of a specific substance, molecule, or compound in a sample. Okay. I just had to ask GPT that. So I'm genuinely like super shocked by this. So I did a little looking into like BSL levels, and it goes up to 4, and 4 is like Ebola. So like in on the one hand, it's like, well, we don't know of any pathogens here, but on the other hand, we've got like the plagues brought by the European explorers,
right?
Which kind of suggests that wouldn't be super great.
I totally agree. The one point I will make on this, and he doesn't say how long the bodies have been there, but he makes it clear they had been there for some time, and he was coming into a well-established program that was not only well-established, but had been around long enough to stagnate and be revitalized in the 90s. That implies to me that we're talking about the timeline that David Grusch is talking about, where in the 30s and 40s, these craft are crashing, we're recovering bodies. I might be wrong, but I don't believe our like biosafety procedures were quite as refined in the 40s. Not. And I totally buy that these things were collected, put into freezers, taken care of. And by the time we get around to implementing proper modern biosafety levels, they've already interacted with these things enough to know, like, if someone was going to get sick with an alien plague, it would have happened by now.
Yeah, it would have happened. Yeah. Okay. So here's the other
But I agree. It's surprising. Yeah.
Here's the other reason I'm still a little surprised. But maybe it's explained by what you just said, which is that like sample return missions done by NASA have to be done in BSL-4 facilities. Not necessarily that we're worried about moon plagues, but that we don't want to, like when we're looking for evidence of life, we don't want to put our own life in there. And so there's the author said that like there's all this evidence of genes from our biome. Like, well, maybe.
Yeah. Now, I will stress, I don't know shit about genetic engineering. Maybe that's just not a concern. And when you're looking at the actual genetics, you just know. But yes, I completely agree. It is very surprising to find out these things are not kept in full, like I'm surprised they don't have biosafety level 5.
Yeah, right. Just for this.
Yeah. And again, I think it comes back to how long we've had these samples. If something crashed today for the first time, I think you're probably right that you would immediately see those biohazard tents thrown up around it, and it goes into full Ebola style lockdown. You don't get in without like double and triple checking. I don't know. You're totally right, though. He even flags it. He's like, contrary to what you might imagine, it's only BSL-3. So even he finds it surprising. So you're not wrong to pick up on that. All right. So the last thing I want to say about the lab itself is the alien body storage. He said EBO carcasses are preserved in horizontal freezers at a temperature of negative 80 degrees Celsius nominal. To maximize the preservation of these carcasses, they are preserved in vacuum bags, and the air in the room is controlled to minimize humidity. There are only 4 bodies, and none of them are complete. That's a distressing word to hear when describing a body. It is obvious that these creatures died as a result of major trauma. I've never witnessed a motorcycle accident fatality, but it probably looks similar to this.
It's horrifying.
Yeah. It is acknowledged that there are more EBO carcasses at other locations. Now, all of that kind of makes sense to me. If you ask me to imagine, how do they store the bodies? I'm picturing, this is probably a scene from Independence Day, like this weird, windowless room with, dry ice frost pouring out of, a glass container that you can see the body in. And, the president's like, my God, that kind of thing. But I'm kind of laughing because the way he describes it, I also can't help but imagine the chest freezer that my father-in-law keeps the deer meat that he gets from going out hunting in.
Yeah, and there's a metal table next to it with a big Ziploc bag, and they're wrestling the alien into the zippy bag.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's more technical than that. But between this shining sci-fi vision and this idea of my father-in-law's garage, I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah. Next up, the genetics. This is a huge part of the article. Anybody who's listening to us who knows about genetics,
sorry,
please go read the article, because you're not going to get much from me talking. This is an amateur who doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. I'm going to share a couple of the conclusions from the genetics section. So he does a lot of laying out all the complicated technical words and then saying, here's what that means.
Okay.
So first of all, he talked about a common ancestry. He said, their genetics are like ours, based on DNA. This fact was very puzzling for me when I first learned about it.
Sure. We
would imagine that beings from an alternate biosphere would have genetics based on a completely foreign biochemical system. And surprisingly, this is not the case. Several conclusions can be drawn from this surprising revelation. The one that immediately comes to mind is that our biosphere and theirs share a common ancestry.
I mean, sure. That is a conclusion you could draw from that, but I feel like it's not the only conclusion.
No, it's not. But, if you have to explain it somehow, the next place you go to is they're fully genetically engineered, they're hybridized, somehow stuff from our biosphere has been introduced into their system. And no matter what you think about it, that's weird.
Yeah, I mean, that could be part of it. The thing I'm really thinking about, there's this excellent episode of YouTube by Cool Worlds, and they talk about silicon-based life forms and how that would pan out, and they share some reputable theories about how this would look. And at the end of the day, they also talk about why the way we evolved kind of makes sense from an energy standpoint. That it may not be that DNA is the only way, but there are some reasons that DNA came to be around.
Sure.
But I get what they're saying. You would expect it to be something like DNA. Maybe it has a slightly different chemical. So I don't know. It does.
Yeah.
It's interesting for sure.
And again, I don't know anything about genetics. So, I noted his conclusion here and thought it was weird, but you're totally right. I don't know. Maybe he's making shit up. Maybe there's other perfectly plausible answers for this, but it definitely stuck out as a weird thing. You would expect them to be totally different or similar, but different. Like we see examples of convergent evolution here on the planet. But you can tell that they're like these two things evolved into a crab, but you can tell they came from a different background, that kind of thing,
right. Yeah. I just mostly, I think coming to that big of a conclusion off of this, granted, this person is probably an expert, but it seems like a big conclusion, and I would want to get them on the show before I really felt like that's a thing.
Before I go on to the next thing, I think you just hit an important point. This person is presenting themselves as an expert. They're presenting conclusions. They make a point later on, like, I am remembering details from a job that I left over 10 years ago. And B, he wasn't doing this research from scratch himself and he alone came up with this. He was working on a team and he was drawing on a lot of historical research. So when he says, we've concluded, and he doesn't actually say we've concluded, he says several conclusions can be drawn from. But when he says their genetics are based on DNA and it's compatible with ours, he may not be presenting a fact that he himself discovered. He may be presenting something that the group has verified repeatedly over time, and it is just understood now. So,
that makes sense.
We're hearing from one guy late in the program, and I think it's an important point to hammer, like you were saying, that like he is presenting his recollection of what he learned, not necessarily, I personally discovered all of these facts.
Got it. Yeah, that makes more sense. Cool.
He also talks about the possibility of genetic engineering, and he gets a little more into the details here. He says, what is particularly striking about the EBO genome is the uniformity of these intergenic regions. We see the same sequences repeated everywhere. The result is a minimalist, highly condensed genome. In fact, it's much smaller than ours. The uniformity of these sequences is a major indication of the artificiality of these beings. There is no complex organism on Earth that has such elegance in the sequences. There is no evolutionary pressure that can lead to this kind of characteristic other than genetic engineering.
I don't know. This feels like the intelligent designer.
Chuck is making a face right now that I wish you could all see. Yeah.
This feels like the intelligent design stuff. It's like, oh, it's so elegant. It must be constructed. There's no way this could happen. Like, I don't know. Like, nature's weirder than you think.
You are reminding me of one of my favorite jokes, and I always forget the setup, but it's like different types of professions are debating about whether God exists, and they're all drawing on examples from their profession, right? So, the scientist is like, there's no way God exists because the natural world is too complicated. And the artist is like, God obviously exists because there's no way something so beautiful would spontaneously arrive, yada, 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 right? Yeah. But the punchline is the urban planner says there's no way God exists because an intelligent designer would never route a waste management system through a public water park.
Yes, absolutely. Love that.
All right, let's move on from the genetics section where we don't know what the hell we're talking about, and let's get to the stuff that makes a little more sense and is a little easier to understand. Let's talk about anatomy. There is a surprising amount here. I kept trying to whittle down my notes and get it smaller and tighter, and even when I purged it down to just like the bare minimum of what I thought needed to be talked about, it's still one of the biggest sections in here.
Okay, cool.
So he starts out by saying they are morphologically very similar to the gray aliens that are part of modern folklore. Their height is about 150 centimeters, which for those of us Americans who don't think in centimeters, that's about 4'11". They have 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. Still, there are some noticeable differences. starting out by talking about the head. He says, the head contains 2 large, oversized eyes, 2 nostrils without protuberance, a narrow mouth without lips, and 2 ear canals without auricles. Okay, so far this matches what you picture when you think of an alien, right? They don't have ears sticking out of their head. They have a small nose, a little slit for a mouth, big wraparound eyes. There are no teeth or tongue in the oral cavity, and there are no vocal cords in this region. Vocalization is produced by a vibration of a membrane in the lungs. This is a fascinating detail to me. The lore, of course, tells us that Greys mostly communicate telepathically, but there's a weird detail. I don't know if you remember this. In the Betty and Barney Hill story, they describe the aliens making this kind of like whistling or warbling sound by vibrating a flap.
Okay.
So I don't know. It's just interesting when these stories all kind of align like that.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Sorry, there's a bunch of thunder overhead, so it'll be interesting to see how that comes through the recording.
Oh, yeah. The next part that I found fascinating, and this is another thing we've heard rumors of for years, but getting it kind of quote unquote confirmed by a scientist here is fascinating. The gray skin that is often described in folklore is in fact a biosynthetic film, which likely serves to protect the EBO from a hostile environment. Under the gray film, the epidermis is rather white, and the texture is very regular without any hair. We do not see any defect other than the folds near the joints. It's described as greasy in one report, but that's not something I have observed. The same report states that a strong, lingering smell of burned hair and ammonia is present when the film is removed. There are a lot of pores on the skin, crossing from the epidermis to a gland in the hypodermis. These glands and pores are the terminal part of the excretory sudoriferous system, which could explain the previously mentioned smell.
Okay, well, just, for those members of our audience that don't know that, what did you just say?
I'm not going to lie. I had to look it up. Sudoriferous, it just means pertaining to sweat.
Okay.
So excretory, meaning waste, sudoriferous, meaning sweat. Basically, it's a combined waste/sweat gland.
Wow.
This is fascinating. So this leads us right to the next section where he's talking about the waste system. There are no genitals and no anus. There is no large orifice like an anus or urethra to get rid of biological waste. Now, he has a whole section here explaining this, but I'm going to real briefly punch it up. Waste in the form of ammonia is carried to thousands of excretory pores. The rationale behind this unusual excretory system is directly related to this excreted ammonia, which enables thermoregulation by evaporating on the skin's surface.
Wow.
That is a wild detail.
Yeah. And I mean, it explains why they're so interested in our anuses, right?
What is this?
What is this thing? What do you do here? Can we have them? So the other...
Please? I'm covered in ammonia all the time.
Oh, God, right. So here's my question. Even if the gray biofilm allows the ammonia to evaporate, wouldn't you still get other things? Or do they like only consume things that break down to ammonia?
You'd imagine. Imagine you were wearing like a Tyvek painting suit.
Yeah.
Skin tight all the time.
And you're just peeing in it.
Oh my God. Like you would be so miserable so fast.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. This is a weird detail. Now, maybe this biofilm is smarter than we're imagining,
maybe.
And like the ammonia is allowed to evaporate and it doesn't really cause a problem. But they explicitly mentioned when they removed the film, there's a strong smell of ammonia and burned hair. It doesn't sound very pleasant under there. Now, leaving aside like cultural differences and things like that, Yes, absolutely. I also think like you're basically peeing inside a suit that you never take off. That sounds weird. The only thing I can imagine is maybe this is not clothing, or like he explicitly describes it as a film, not clothing or skin. He says the epidermis is under it. That kind of implies to me that it might be maybe protective gear. If they're coming into our environment, maybe it's about I don't know though. It's a weird
It's actually just like years and years of poo buildup. An interest. Sorry.
Maybe this is why they assume they're disposable.
Yeah, right. Oh, God. It's like, they're so smelly. Like, it's terrible.
Nobody's gonna want to live in this body for long.
So, one interesting thing that just occurred to me was that in zero gravity, like waste elimination is quite difficult for astronauts because water doesn't want to break off. The surface tension is so high that you can just create, like, there's this video of one of the astronauts pulling a bunch of water out of his little like water bottle, and it just stays on the straw. And so it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't have our bits. Our bits don't work in zero G, so they'd have to do something else.
I hadn't even thought about that, but they have suggested that these are genetically engineered beings. If they're genetically engineered for space flight and living in craft, not having an excretory system would certainly save you some engineering on the ship.
Absolutely.
Speaking of their excretory system, let's talk about their liquid diet. He says, given the absence of teeth, the narrowness and rigidity of the esophagus, the absence of a true stomach, and the absence of defecation, it is strongly believed that the EBOs can only consume food in liquid form. It is assumed that, given the high metabolic needs of their brains, which is a section I cut out entirely. He talks a little bit about their brains. Basically, they're bigger and more complicated than ours, but in ways that we don't really understand. This food would have a high carbohydrate concentration. In order to meet other metabolic needs, there must also be a high protein content in the food consumed. These two statements are supported by the type of enzymes secreted by the digestive organ. It is therefore speculated that the food consumed is some sort of rich broth in sugar and protein. Wild. Now, Annie has a lot of dietary restrictions, and one of the only foods she can eat is chicken broth, and I can't imagine living entirely on it. That would be really unpleasant.
Yeah, sweet chicken broth.
But again, I will say this is something we have heard in the lore. People have commented before that abductee testimony, nobody ever talks about seeing aliens eat. And when they've asked them about it, they said, oh, we don't eat food the way that you do. There's a really strange story by the name of Rachel's Eyes, which has come recommended by a few people because it depicts a military man who gets roped into the UFO crash retrieval program. And they say it was a very accurate depiction of the crash retrieval program. But part of the story involves a young hybrid alien who comes to live on the base, and they have to have very specific liquid food made for them. So yeah, I don't know. Like it's not definitive. It doesn't mean anything, but it's really interesting when all these accounts kind of start clicking into place like this.
Yeah. What I'm taking away from this really is, if you have a diet entirely of like Soylent and Huel, your skin will turn gray and you'll develop telepathic abilities.
There you go.
It's obvious.
Time to get started.
since we're coming to easy conclusions here.
All right, last bit of anatomy. Let's talk about their eyes.
Cool.
He said, like the skin, the eyes are covered in a semi-transparent biosynthetic film that offers the same environmental protection while providing protection against certain wavelengths and light intensity. When the film is removed, a more traditional eye is revealed. It is about 3 times larger than a human eye, and there are no eyelids. The size of their eyes suggests that they have excellent night vision, so it seems paradoxical to cover them with a semi-opaque film. Perhaps they only need to wear it in a bright environment. On the retina, there are at least 6 types of cone cells, and the result is a broader visible spectrum. Now, I really like the idea that the kind of black eyes that we always see in the lore are some sort of a protective cover, like built-in sunglasses. You know, there are aliens. There are animals on our planet who have nictating membranes that are kind of an inner eyelid that protect the eye in severe things. So this both has a biological precedence in our biosphere of, you know, a built-in eye protection, but also in the lore. There is a Twitter account that it's almost gotta be bullshit, but this woman claims to be channeling aliens that live in the Sandia mountain range in New Mexico, and she runs the Twitter account for them. So the aliens answer questions through her. If nothing else, it's really entertaining. But one of the things that's interesting is she is an artist, and when she draws the aliens, they look like your traditional grays, except they have human style eyes with big irises and pupils and colored eyes and stuff. And it's crazy how much more relatable they feel. Like how much of the negative visceral reaction we get to the traditional gray alien is really down to those unnatural black eyes. You put normal, quote unquote, normal eyes on them, they feel totally normal. And in the lore on that Twitter account, they're very clear. Like the black lenses you see are because we're used to a much more low light environment. So we put them on when we leave the caves, basically. But down in the caves, when we're in our natural light level, they're retracted and we look like this. Yeah.
No, I mean, that actually completely makes sense. Again, from like the spacefaring aspect, we have to do exactly the same thing with spacesuits. There's like the air containing glass, but then there's a gigantic reflective screen that goes over it because the sun is so much more intense outside of our atmosphere that you really have to have that.
Right.
The 6 different cones is also really fascinating. And I wonder what other parts of the spectrum they're seeing. But did it mention anything about rods? Because otherwise, the cones don't do super well at night.
No, which is something people pointed out. They're like, okay, he goes out of his way to mention cones. He mentions they have big eyes and excellent night vision, but he doesn't mention rods at all. And people thought that was a weird thing to leave out. The thing I will say, and we talk about this more a little later, this guy was a molecular biologist who most of his writing was about the genetics and cell cultures. I don't believe he spent a lot of time doing dissections of the bodies. I think most of the information about the anatomy he was getting from the articles he read. For example, he mentioned a report said that the skin was greasy and smelled. That wasn't something I observed. Well, it kind of makes sense if like the first scientist in there did the dissection and peeled the skin off. And he comes in and like, it's just a body in a vacuum bag in a freezer, and he doesn't have to interact with it much other than harvesting cells from it.
So this is like,
I don't know.
These are all things he got in those first 2 weeks of onboarding.
Right. It might be. Or it might be that he's completely making it up and these are obvious mistakes.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Okay, Chuck, let's get weirder.
I thought you'd never ask.
Let's talk about the alien religion. Okay, buddy.
All right.
Now, I'm going to actually lead with the disclaimer that he makes at the end of this section. He wrote 3 paragraphs, one of which was a disclaimer on the topic of religion. Please be advised that I am speaking from memory of something I read more than 10 years ago. Take the following with a grain of salt. Also, note that this information comes from a document that I read. So This is not something he personally knows. This is something he read in a document. We're going to come back to a point that he makes, but first, let's get to the summary of the religion itself. He says, EBOs believe that the soul is not an extension of the individual, but rather a fundamental characteristic of nature that expresses itself as a field, not unlike gravity. In the presence of life, the field acquires complexity. With time and with the right conditions, life in turn becomes more complex until the appearance of sentient life. After reaching this threshold, the field begins to express itself through these sentient beings, forming what we call the soul. Through their life experiences, sentient beings will in turn influence the field in a sort of positive feedback loop. This in turn further accelerates the complexity of the field. Eventually, when the field reaches a critical mass, there will be a sort of apotheosis, which is a word I had to look up that means the perfect form of something or the elevation of something to a divine status. There will be a sort of apotheosis. It is not clear what this means in practical terms, but this quest for apotheosis seems to be the EBO's main motivation.
Whoa. All right. So that sounds a lot like all of the elementary particle physics stuff that we're doing right now, and like the string theory and field theory. And it's fascinating to think about that on a sort of like evolutionary scale. And I am delighted by this.
Yeah. Now, I have two reactions to this. First of all, this sounds a lot like Star Wars. Like, oh, it's an energy field that connects all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us, right? Like, hey, that's the Force. And, you know, this is not the only instance we see of ideas that we see in UFO culture popping up in pop culture. And there's a few ways to think about that. One is everything in UFO culture is fraudulent and just lifted from pulp culture. Another way to think of it is pop culture is being seeded by agents from the intelligence community who are trying to put these ideas out into public in a more palatable way. Another way is that George Lucas and Gene Roddenberry were channeling unintentionally, you know, hidden truths of the universe. I don't fucking know. Who knows? But I find it fascinating where you get these echoes, these kind of similarities popping up here and there. There are a lot of things we hear about a galactic federation, and it's really hard to hear the word federation and not think of Star Trek.
Yeah, right.
And both in UFO culture and in Star Trek, the Federation is a group of civilizations from throughout the galaxy that have come together to help other species, you know. Anyway.
How are you going to feel if you find out, like, we finally make contact and they mention the Prime Directive?
Dude, so thrilled. But, okay, you set me up perfectly. This brings me to my next point.
Okay.
There is a really famous book out there called The Raw Contacts, or The Law of One. This is more channeled material. Okay. Depending on how you feel about channeled material, you may be immediately scoffing and dismissing everything I say. I don't know. What I will say is there are a handful of books that I've read in my life that immediately resonated with me on a primal, fundamental level. And two of those books have to do with consciousness, souls, the afterlife, etc. I have no proof for this. I don't talk about this much on this show because we tend to stick to the more tangible aspects of this. But I bring it up because, again, there is a lot of lore out there around this idea that the soul, the ongoing consciousness, is the primal part of the universe. Scientists tend to think space-time is the the foundational force that everything is built on, and these people tend to say it's actually the other way around. Space-time emerges from the soul. This is a whole big complicated topic, and frankly, I've kind of wondered if we could make an episode about it at some point.
Probably.
It would be real weird, and it would be a divergent from our usual, like, how does Congress feel about UFOs? But I would love to do it. But all I will say is everything he says here aligns really uncannily with a number of other places that I've read this same kind of idea, that at the end of the day, this idea of telepathy has more to do with being in contact with the kind of like oversoul, your higher self, whatever you want to think of. And this idea that reincarnation is real, and humans are unusual because we live under this really heavy veil that keeps us from remembering our past lives, keeps us from remembering that we're all connected. And as a result, we meet these other races who are aware of this, what to them seems like an obvious truth. And they're like, what the hell is wrong with you guys?
Interesting.
Like, why are you so obsessed with this life?
Yeah.
I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So the next paragraph, he talks about this very idea. He said, the author of the document added his reflections and interpretations as an appendix. He specified that for the EBOs, this soul field is not a belief, but an obvious truth.
Sure.
Calling it a religion is a bit of a misnomer. To them, it's as clear as gravity or light. Like, you can see it, you can observe it. Of course it's true. He argues that the soul loses its individuality after death, but that memory and experience persist as part of the field. This fact would influence the philosophy and culture of EBOs, resulting in a society that does not fear death, but which places no importance or reverence on individuality. This belief compels them to seed life, shape it, nurture it, monitor it, and influence it for the ultimate purpose of creating this apotheosis. Paradoxically, they have little or no respect for an individual's well-being. All of our respect around an individual's well-being has to do with the fact that at the end of the day, we don't know if there's a life after this. Ending someone's life is one of the worst things you could possibly do. But if you knew there was an afterlife, if you know for a fact that you will be reincarnated, you have lived before and you will live again, how would that change you? How would that change your society? And this idea, we've heard this idea before, that maybe we're an engineered race, or that they've had a hand in shaping us. I've never heard a why. Why would they do that? Why would they care?
Apotheosis.
What possible purpose would you have to go to another planet and find some apes in the trees and, like, teach them how to cook? Like, I don't understand. Well, here's the answer. They have a goal of getting as much sentient life in the universe as possible to achieve apotheosis. They are heading towards a goal. Getting us there is less about us and more about anything that advances the cause of moving us towards the critical mass of sentience is the ultimate goal. And it doesn't matter if you die or an individual dies, or frankly, if humans die, because to them it is obvious. Anyway, I'm getting so sucked in. This stuff is so weird and so woolly and so exciting to me. I don't know, man.
Okay, so I've been watching a lot about the Higgs field recently, and one of the things that one of the videos talked about was that perhaps there aren't elementary particles like electrons, but there are perturbations of the Higgs field of a size that represent an electron, and it is still kind of a field.
Okay.
But that kind of like feels very analogous to this, that we would see all of these like perturbations of the Higgs field wrapped up in a person. But then if all of those perturbations fell apart, it would just kind of dissipate out into the other parts of the Higgs field. But what I wonder about is whether sentience would really be important there, or if it would actually be like physical complexity. Because when we die, we decay.
Yeah, I don't know.
And we would like spread. I mean, our Higgs complexity doesn't change.
Yeah,
it just dissipates a little bit. So I love it. I think it's a great idea.
Right?
And
it's fascinating.
Super interesting.
Now, there is one detail that I left off of his little preface. He said, note that this information comes from a document whose author was directly interacting with an EBO. It is not specified whether it was an ambassador, a crash survivor, or a prisoner. The means of communication were not specified either.
Okay. Yeah.
Direct interaction,
right?
huh?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Horrifying to think, but maybe these weren't motorcycle victims when they got here.
Oh, jeez. You got dark with this. I was assuming it was a different one.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Bodies were the crash victims, not after he was done telling them about the religion. They're like, well, time to hack
what do they care? They don't believe in in death.
Oh, man. But yeah, so remember he said it was understood that there are other bodies elsewhere. We've now got evidence that they talked to at least one living alien, which is where they got this information about religion. The reason I mention this stuff, and, the religion stuff is just fun, but the reason I bring this up is, again, this shoehorns with Grusch's claims that there are programs. A long-running collection of programs. It's not one program. It's not one building somewhere. It is, they've farmed out, the intact craft to the major defense contractors. They've sent bits of wreckage and individual pieces to material scientists to work on reverse engineering. The bodies are in one lab. There's a different group doing something else. All of this kind of fits with Grusch's idea that there are multiple programs out there. So I mention that because I find this, I would have found it suspicious if the guy said, I worked in the lab where all of the alien bodies are kept. I don't think that's how a program would operate. I think you would have multiple labs working in parallel, and they're not communicating, but it's understood that there are multiple groups out there.
So EBO, okay, a question first. Is EBO like a commonly known term in the community?
I'd never heard it before now. It may be. It may be out there. What I will say is he mentions at one point that based on what they learned about its genetics, they now think EBO, exobiospheric organism, is a misnomer. It is quite evidently part of our biosphere, at least to some degree. But it feels like one of the older acronyms. And we do hear about this, that, different acronyms and terms have come in and out of favor. For example, E.T., there's a reason Spielberg used that. That was the terminology for a time. They now favor non-human intelligence, partly because E.T. is too explicitly tied to the idea that they're from another planet, and it may be something more complex than that. Maybe they're from another dimension. Maybe they're time travelers. NHI better captures the idea that we don't know what it is. EBO does have the advantage of, while it says they're from outside our biosphere, it doesn't say what they are. It doesn't make any presumptions about it. It's just, I don't know. Here. It feels like the biological equivalent of UFO to me. So I don't know if it was in common use, but it kind of fits my understanding of the kind of 40s and 50s style acronyms.
What I wonder about is whether Black Vault has already done like a FOIA request for EBO. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure. Okay. Yeah. I'm sure it's just been added to his list of keywords. All right, so let's get to the meat and potato of this. So if you remember, this is a Reddit post. And I kind of teased at the beginning that Reddit didn't know what to make of it. But I want to really hammer on that because that's really unusual on Reddit. The crowd tends to coalesce pretty quickly around this is bullshit or this is something. And there's always fighting. There's always groups who hold on to anything. But pretty quickly you get a majority consensus. This has been split since day one, and no one ever came to kind of a consensus around it. Lots of people tried. Lots of people stated it. But I'm not going to source these quotes. These are samples of what I was hearing, but every quote I'm sharing, I want to be clear. I read 5 different variations of the same quote from a different person saying the same thing. So the first thing is the poster has now deleted his account.
Okay.
He was struggling with moderation. As you and I know from our attempts to post our show to our UFOs, there's a pretty heavy moderation crew there. Your posts are initially put into a buffer. They have to be approved, yada, yada. And if you don't have a lot of posting history, you tend to end up with your post being shadow banned and stuff. And that appears to have happened to him. He was using a VPN, and it just got added to the list of signals why he seemed untrustworthy. The mods were talking to him and trying to get him to validate his identity, and he wouldn't do it, which I don't blame him for, although the mods were promising him anonymity. If you are working in the type of program where, as David Grusch alleges, people have been killed for leaking it, I don't think I would trust some random Reddit mod to protect my life either. So he would not validate his identity. And then at some point, he was pretty active for a number of hours, responding to comments quite quickly with detailed answers. And then he said, I've been getting some very disconcerting private messages, went quiet for a while, and ended up deleting his account. So the community was left with this brief, highly interactive period, followed by absolute radio silence. We're not going to be able to get in touch with this guy. It's just down to the crowd. And there were a bunch of people who thought he seemed legit and a bunch of people who thought he seemed suspect. A couple of quotes from people who thought he sounded legit. I have a master's degree in biochemistry and a medical degree. This is likely a person with, at the very minimum, a degree in a biological field and with some years of lab work. And another person who responded, this was an awesome read. I have worked in a biosecurity level 3 lab, and I can attest that this person, at the very least, has actual hardcore lab experience.
That's cool.
Again, this was something we saw over and over again. People are like, I'm not talking about what he's claiming, but the way he talks about how a lab operates says to me, this guy has experience. That doesn't mean he's not making up all of his claims, but he knows enough to talk coherently about it. Counterpoint on people who thought he seemed suspect. Someone said, if I was writing up a fake story about alien genetics and microbiology, many of the things that the OP wrote would sound very complex to the layperson, but it's all something that is learned in a 300-level undergrad course in genetics. A bunch of people were picking on various misuses of anatomical terms. Someone said, he also said the medial toe is marginally longer than the distal toe. Day 1 of gross anatomy teaches you that if he is describing a foot with only 2 toes, he should have described it as a medial toe and a lateral toe. I would expect someone of this level to know basic anatomical terms.
I don't know, whatever. And also, like, it's very difficult to, as someone who's interviewed a lot of people, it is very difficult to level someone based on solely what they say. Just, I don't know.
Right. I will say that your skepticism on that last point is echoed by another common thread. And there were two people who talked about this that I wanted to emphasize. And again, both of these, multiple people made the same points. One person said, molecular biologists, anthropologists like this guy, and a large number of other subspecialists in biology simply do not understand anatomy and physiology to the same level and degree that a medical doctor would. This guy absolutely fucking nails the molecular biology jargon in this post, but he repeatedly makes minor mistakes in medical jargon and gross anatomy. This supports his description of his educational background. People with doctorates in molecular biology have a good passing knowledge of anatomy and physiology, but nowhere near the level of a medical doctor. Sense. I want to really emphasize that because it makes perfect sense. But there are things he did that were dead on accurate. Everybody's like, this guy knows what he's talking about. He has worked in a lab. He has done this kind of work. And there are things he said that are completely wrong. The things he got wrong are exactly the kind of things you would think someone with an advanced molecular biology degree would get wrong, misremembering the anatomy class they took in freshman year of college.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? And then last of all, remember we talked about the fact that he was a PhD who was basically working as a technician? So someone says the EBO scientist offers plenty of speculation and makes several statements without offering any supporting evidence. This is consistent with a PhD graduate immediately hired into a technical level job who stays at that job for about 10 years and then falls out of science. Which, damn, first of all, but also fair. Again, the kind of mistakes he was making, the things we were picking on where like, oh, he's kind of jumping to a conclusion, but not really supporting it. How much of that is because this guy was bragging about being a PhD, but then he wasn't doing PhD level work. He was doing lab technician work. And you're working in an established program with a smaller group of people. You're not being challenged on your assumptions the way that you might in the broader community. You're not publishing, so your ideas aren't being challenged by people outside your immediate lab. So again, the mistakes he's making are exactly the kind of mistakes we would expect from someone in the position as he describes himself. So I don't know. I included those two because I thought it was really funny. The idea that the mistakes he makes are actually compelling evidence that he's telling the truth.
Everything I've read here, like I said, it was difficult to level someone based on their, just purely on what they're writing and what they're saying. But to me, yes, this does sound like someone who is slightly less mature and slightly more willing to jump to conclusions and get excited about stuff and write it down. And to me, as someone who's entering a very senior phase of his career, I'm recognizing the downsides of that kind of stuff. And I feel like I've got a really different view of, and it just doesn't feel like they're 40, you know, which you would hope for someone who was that.
I think what I will say is the part that feels right to me is you work at a technology company. Imagine that part of the work you were doing at that technology was secret. It's exciting. Your peers would be really excited if they found out about it, but you're not allowed to talk about it. You work at that company for a number of years. Eventually you quit. 10 years later, you are no longer doing technical work. Stories about the kind of work you were doing start becoming popular, and you go, oh, I can talk about this. And you jump on Reddit and you post your 10-year-old memory of the kinds of conversations you were having with your coworkers around why you were making technical decisions and why you believed things, certain things that you didn't even think to question because they were just self-evident truths in your group you include in the post. You put it up and people start ripping it apart. And they're pointing to some of your conclusions that you don't remember how your group came to this conclusion. Maybe someone who worked there 30 years before you did, and everyone just knows it, and you don't have the proof to point to. And the longer it goes on, the more you realize, oh God, I can't back any of this up in a way that is going to convince anyone. You're telling the truth, but you're 10 years removed from the day-to-day practice of this. Those details are going to be fuzzy. I don't remember the justification for why I used a particular library on a website I set up 6 months ago. I can't imagine. Well, in fact, I can't imagine. I was working in tech.
You were working in tech
if
with
you asked
me
hey, Scott,
at a 20-person company.
Yeah. We worked, one of the sites we worked on was for LimeWire, the BitTorrent website. We worked on that site for 6 months. Literally, we were supposed to launch it the day that they lost their court case and no longer existed as a company. This would be like if you and I sat down to write a retrospective of what we learned from LimeWire 10 years later. We would remember parts of it, but people would ask us questions. We'd be like, I have no idea why we picked that bit of technology or what it, we would get terms. So all of that is to say, yes, again, I don't know if what he is saying is true, but for me, I found the feedback from people who work in his industry pointing out that he very clearly does have the degree he has, and he very clearly has worked and done lab work for many years in biosecure labs, the way that he is describing. The mistakes he makes feel like the kind of mistakes that are appropriate for a person with his background and his distance from the events. And I find it very compelling how much synchronicities, how many echoes we get from things he's saying that we're hearing from other sources. That said, I would not blame anyone at all if you listen to everything we just said. It was like, this is the biggest crock of horse shit. I can't believe Scott is going for this.
the post about someone working for 10 years in science and then falling out of it, it occurs to me that if you think about this person's resume, they got a PhD and then did nothing with it for 10 years because they can't talk about what they did. And
exactly. It's very hard to go civilian with a 10-year
gap. Right. 10 years after you get your degree, like who's going to hire that? And, or alternatively, even if you could get a job, it would be entry level, not the job of someone who has 10 years experience.
My understanding is people in these kind of secret programs usually have a cover job. Okay. You have your job that on paper you have, so you're still receiving a paycheck. You can show I worked at Battelle, but it's not going to be a prestigious science job. You weren't publishing papers. You can't tell anybody about any of the work you were doing.
Yeah.
It's not a blank spot on your resume, but it might as well be in terms of, like you said, you weren't doing any career growth that you are allowed to talk about or that another employer would consider.
Alternatively, it also makes me realize that I should start answering in my interviews. I can't talk about that. Anytime there's an awkward question.
I'm sorry. I'm unable to answer that question in a public session.
Exactly. That's so good.
Oh my God. All right. Well, Chuck, we're kind of pulling up to the end here. I'm going to pull out my t-shirt that we just had made with the hashtag Let Chuck Talk. I just talked at you for quite a while about a crazy story from Reddit about David Grusch getting potentially smeared by the intelligence community. What do you think, man? What are your thoughts on this week's show?
Yeah, I'm into it. The Grusch's thing, like, I don't even want to mention it. It's like, it's such a non-story. I'm glad he got out in front of it, but it's a shit story from a shit organization and a shit journalist. So as far as I care, it didn't happen. I mean, it's important news for people to know, but I'm pretty done with it. But the EVO scientist, fascinating fiction. If it's nonfiction, that's great. But I think it's a fun speculation about what Greys could be. And there are some aspects in there that are like genuinely interesting. And I'm for it. I would love to see that be true.
I'm for it.
But just the conclusions that he came to, or the author came to, I don't know if it's a he, the author, I don't buy most of those. But I would love to be, I'd love to be proven wrong. And I would love to be able to dig into this more. So I hope that disclosure happens, capital D. Let's do it. Or even lowercase d, whatever that means.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. I will point out to anybody, obviously I got a little excited there talking about the religion and consciousness and soul aspect. I talked about channeling. I know that's not everyone's cup of tea. But Chuck and I are still kind of figuring out what we're doing with this podcast. If that's something you're interested in hearing more about,
I've actually
maybe
gotten
not
that
as
feedback.
a main episode.
Like I have had people ask me, to cover the Law of One and to talk about some of the other stuff as well as news. So I think this is a good episode for us. Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, I will think about it. One possibility is maybe that becomes like a bonus episode on Patreon. We haven't figured out how to handle things like bonus episodes, but maybe it's the thing that makes it happen. Or if you're just really interested and you want us to have a full episode where we're just gonna dive in and get real weird with consciousness and spirituality, let me know, because I am clearly happy to go there.
I think we should. You've been teasing it for so long that at this point I'm just like, oh, we got to do this. I'm excited. Who cares? Who cares what our audience thinks?
I'm slowly pulling you deeper and deeper
so bad.
Into the deep end of the pool. We started out like, oh, maybe the videos are real, but I don't know if they're alien. And now you're like, okay, yeah, maybe they're alien, but I don't think they're interdimensional. I'm like, get in here so I can talk to you about reincarnation.
Yeah, exactly. But you know what? I'm digging it, and I have had so many like interesting and productive arguments with friends now. Like, I'm definitely becoming that UFO guy, and I wasn't okay with it in the beginning, but I'm actually getting okay with it. It's pretty fun now.
It's so fun to talk about, right? At the end of the day, who cares? It's just
absolutely.
Fun. All right. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us on It's a Very Exciting Time. You can find show notes and more on our website, veryexcitingtime.com, as well as links to our social media accounts.
And you can email us at Scott or Chuck at veryexcitingtime.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at patreon.com/veryexcitingtime.
And Chuck, as always, my wife thanks you for listening to me talk about UFOs, so she doesn't have to.